and the workers begin to pass them, passing one after the others under the host's power. And the forces of this all-powerful regime liquid. The weapons pass to the no one is willing to defend the Tsar, who must abdicate. And so the power, the real power, is in the streets, in the hands of the masses. And the masses start building the organism for a new form of power. And this is how Soviets are reborn. Soviet in Russian means council, committee. They were born in 1905 revolution as an extended strike committee. And as the revolution progresses, they become political instruments for the struggle for the power. The bodies of direct democracy with electable and revocable delegates from the factories, from the army wards, responding on a direct and flexible way to the base. And for the first time, the workers and soldiers Soviet in Petrograd marks the revolutionary fusion of the working class and the peasants. As I said, soldiers are overwhelming peasants in arms. So the power is in de facto in the hands of the Soviets. The working class made the revolution, but as Lenin said later on, it was not enough conscious and organized to keep the power and complete the revolution. So to the leadership of the Soviets in the first stage of the revolution rise the Menshevik and the social revolution. They were given the power by the mass, and what did they do? They delivered it into the hands of the bourgeoisie in the form of the provisional government. Bourgeoisie in Russia definitely did not want the revolution. Until the very end, it tried to even save the monarchy by wrestling only a few concessions. But then in the light of the revolution, it is forced to create the provisional government with the declared purpose to retain control of the situation, to prevent power from falling into the hands of the oppressed. How it is composed, this provisional government? The president is Lvov, a prince. The foreign minister is Milyukov, the leader of the cadets, the party of the big owners, landowners, such as, in reality, the government has no real power. The real power is in the executive of the Soviet. But it gives the government its legitimacy through the reform. This created a situation of dualism where two classes, different classes, opposed to each other, rely on different state bodies of power that are incompatible. It is a situation typical of a revolutionary. It is always an unstable situation, which must ultimately result in the prevalence of one or the other class, and thus of one type or another. Now, in this situation, reformists openly capitulate. Even the Bolsheviks in the early stage. In Petrograd, there are only minor leaders. The main ones are exiled, and the leaders lag behind the event. The masses are far, far ahead. Then the first leaders to arrive in Petrograd arrive from Siberia. They are Kamenev, Stalin, and they impose a right wing. Stalin proposes a line of critical support for the provisional government. He used the expression, we must support the government insofar as it consolidates the progress. In reality, the party base is much more to the left. It wants the power to be in the hands of the Soviet alone, but the leadership doesn't listen. Now, the fundamental distinction in the previous years between the Bolsheviks, while they abandon this point of difference, Kamenev and Stalin also work for a unification. While all this happens, you can imagine Lenin is still stuck in Switzerland. He immediately grasps the essence of the problem. He's very worried the party is taking the wrong line. And on the 6th of March, he sends a telegram. And this is the telegram. Our tactic, no trust in and no support of the new government. Kerensky in particular is particularly suspect. Arming of the proletariat is the only guarantee. Immediate election to the Petrograd City Council. No rapprochement with other parties. A whole program is contained in a few words. And from that moment, he began to bomb the Pravda editorial board with letters, the famous letters from afar, which elaborate and developed on this line. Of these letters, Pravda published only one, because Kamenev and Stalin do not share Lenin's. They say he has gone mad. He has become Trotskyist. And in fact, Trotsky had already explained years earlier with the theory of the permanent revolution that in a backward country, it is the proletariat that has to fulfill the tasks of the bourgeois revolution. In doing so, it has to take power and seamlessly take over the tasks of the socialists. Of course, this is possible only in the context of an international expansion, which would then involve the strong working class of the advanced. Lenin and the Bolsheviks had instead advocated a more ambiguous, ultimately less correct formula. It was the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasant. And as was often the case in Lenin's life, at this point Bolshevik leaders used against Lenin a formula that Lenin had proposed at an earlier stage. Well, this is a lesson. What does Lenin reply? He replies, "My answer is the Bolshevik slogans and ideas on the whole have been confirmed by his, but concretely things have worked out differently. They are more original, more peculiar, more variegated than anyone could have expected. To ignore or overlook this fact would mean taking after those old Bolsheviks who more than once already have played so regrettable a role in the history of our party by reiterating formulas senselessly learned by rote instead of studying the specific features of the new and living reality." That was Lenin's method, his approach to theory debate. Many times he had to wage such battle inside his own party. Lenin was a great builder of apparatus, but also a destroyer of apparatus when they took on a conservative character and lagged behind the mass, behind the party base, and more importantly, behind the needs that were arising from the objective situation. In truth, from his return to Russia, on all the decisive points, the leader with whom he agreed was Trotsky, who in fact rejoined the Bolshevik Party during the revolution and played a decisive role during the October insurrection. Okay, but let's back to the battle in the party. Lenin finally managed to return to Russia on April the 3rd. He arrives by train in Petrograd. The leaders of the party and also the leaders of the other Soviet parties come to welcome him. Flowers, with ceremonies, with pompous speeches. And he turns and directly addresses to the masses and says, "Long live the war socialist revolution." And he immediately throws himself into the political battle. This was Lenin's style. He puts in writing his ideas. He writes the famous April thesis that has ideas like, "The originality of the present moment in Russia consists in the transition from the first stage of the revolution, who gave power to the bourgeoisie, because of the insufficient degree of consciousness and organization of the proletariat, to its second stage, which must give power to the proletariat and the poor strata of the peasantry." As I said, Lenin was in a position of isolation inside the party. I mean, at least among the leaders. His theses were only published on the Pravda days later, with a note from the editorial board dissociating itself. Lenin does not frighten. And he leans directly on the party base, on the rank and file. He does this battle, and he managed to conquer the party in the April conference. And this battle will be decisive for the future development of the event. Because immediately the provisional government, in fact, start betraying the expectations of the masses. The first demand of the masses was peace, the end of war. But instead, the war continues. And the government, not only that, but the government still pursues a policy of annexations and declared to maintain itself to the agreements with the imperialist power. So this increases discontent the government. Already in April, there are already demonstrations against this policy. And so the bourgeoisie has to lean on the Soviet leaders more directly, not just asking a support to the government, but getting them into the government. And so social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks entered the government directly with ministers. Tsereteli, Chernov, and also Kerensky. We know he entered the government as Minister of War. This creates the first coalition government. It is a coalition between the bourgeoisie and the so-called socialist reformist leaders of the Soviet. Masses are initially happy. They hope for a change, but no change arrived. The truth is that by doing that, the reformists are saving the government and becoming even more servants, the bourgeoisie, which wants to use them just to try to keep control of the situation. To do what? To tire them out, to demoralize them, while preparing conditions for open reaction. This is a classic tactics of the ruling class, which uses the leaders of the workers' movement to regain control of the situation and then throws them away once it has the strength to crush the movement. We've seen that many times, like in the 30s in Spain, France, also in Italy. Yes, but while this is happening, the coalition government changed things, because from now on the masses will directly test the Mensheviks and the socialist revolution. As you know, in a revolution, masses initially seek for unity and often support the reformist parties in the majority, which seem to propose the easier. But in a revolutionary process, the masses test them very quickly, a matter of months, a matter of weeks sometimes. Learn from concrete real experience and then conclude that a more radical alternative is needed. Of course, what's the problem? That this is possible only if an alternative exists. And the April battle allowed the Bolsheviks to stay out of the provisional government, denouncing collaboration with the bourgeoisie and working to win over the masses on the base of the concrete experience. Lenin's slogan since the April thesis was patiently explain, accompanied the learning process of the masses to conquer the majority on the basis of experience. And to get this aim, he puts forward his famous slogan, all power to the Soviets, peace, bread, land, and all power to them. This slogan is very, very known. It must be thoroughly understood. When Lenin advanced the slogan, all the power to the Soviets, the Bolsheviks were a minority into this. So it does not mean all power to the Bolsheviks. It means, well, dear Mensheviks, dear social revolutionaries, you are the majority in the Soviet. We don't all agree with you, but we recognize this reflects the will of the working class and the peasantry at this time. So we say, you take the power and carry out the revolution. Kick the bourgeois ministers out of the government. All the power to the only legitimate body representing workers and soldiers. If you do this, we are prepared to conduct a pacific opposition within the Soviet. The provisional government wouldn't be able to put up any resistance. And however, this would have allowed for a completely peaceful transformation. This is a classic to win over the majority, whereby revolutionaries challenge the reformists just to be consistent in their promises in order to show their true colors to their base and win the majority. That was discussed in depth during the third and the fourth congresses of the International Communists, the tactic of the United. Reformists are unwilling to break up with the bourgeoisie, and so they cannot maintain their promise. The other slogans were peace, bread, and land, not socialist insurrection, but peace, bread, and land. Things that the masses wanted and the reformist parties had promised. But they cannot give the bread because they do not want to challenge those who hold the richer society. And they cannot give peace because the Russian bourgeoisie is subordinate to imperialism and cannot disobey, especially French and British imperialism. Of course, cannot give the land because it is tied to the big landlords through the banks. And so the government becomes more and more exposed. And with this policy, the Bolsheviks begin to gain consensus. Already from April onwards until June, patiently explaining, Lenin said, pressing the leading parties of the Soviets with their transitional demands. So the government and the reformers unleash a campaign against the Bolsheviks. They even invent that Lenin is a German agent, a lie that Stalinists will recycle years later against Trotsky. But it has no effect. To the most combative militant workers, to the most radical soldiers who no longer wanted to fight, they would say, "There, you are a Bolshevik." And maybe they didn't even know who they were, these Bolsheviks. But what they would conclude, well, that maybe the Bolsheviks are right. And the Bolsheviks does gain a majority in the Petrograd working, especially in the factory. And in June, during the first Pan-Russian Congress of the Soviet, they decide to make a show to prove their strength by calling a big armed demonstration. This is insurrection. This is not to seize power. The aim is to put pressure on the Soviet during the Congress to take power. And in fact, they also did this to prevent extremist elements from triggering armed clash well, prematurely. Such a thing would have given room for reaction. The reformist parties in the Soviet unleashed a campaign of slanders, accusing them of wanting to seize power. And so the Bolsheviks, in order not to make room for this campaign, even decide to cancel the demonstration. And so it is the Soviet leaders then decide to call them a demonstration in the following days. And cleverly, the Bolsheviks, they invite the workers and the more radical military units to participate to this demonstration, raising their slogan. And so you have this scene that at a demonstration called by the Soviet ruling parties to support the policy of the government, the slogans everywhere are "Down with the offensive, down with the 10 capitalist ministers, and all power to the Soviets." So this proof of strength by the government and by the reformist parties in the Soviet become a proof of weakness. And you can see the real balance of power that had developed. The Bolsheviks had conquered the most advanced sectors, especially in Petrograd, the factories and the most advanced regiments, including the famous Kronstadt sailors. But they did not have this strength outside Petrograd. And among the broadest sectors of the masses, peasants and the most backward soldiers. And so you see that this situation like this implies the risk of the most advanced sector to become impatient. It is a situation that's common to many revolutions. In a revolution there is always a first stage, an initial explosion of enthusiasm, like in the February days, typically characterized by a sense of unity, of celebration, with a feeling of omnipotence of the masses. But then there are also stages of ebb in the movement, of bewilderment, where the masses see that they are not achieving the goals they have been fighting. Especially the most advanced layers feels that power is slipping from their hands. And so they want to do something and instinctively rush forward to prevent. But if this advanced layer has not the masses behind him, then it exists the risk of making leaps forward that leave it isolated, thus opening the way for counter-revolution. This is, for example, happened in Germany during the Spartacist insurrection in 1919. Perhaps these are the moments where the presence of a firm revolutionary leadership is even more important. And that was shown during the July days. The 3rd of July 1917, an angry demonstration against the government was announced on the streets of Petrograd. It was in particular against the military offensive that Kerensky was launching, betraying all promises. The 1st Machine Gun Regiment, stationed in the workers' neighborhood of Viborg, receives the order to send 500 men to the front line. They are furious. They want to overthrow the provisional government. But that would be a defeat. The balance of power. They start moving. The demonstration is spontaneous, is angry. The CC of the Bolshevik party sends agitators to try to stop it. And no way, they are already on the street. Workers and soldiers together. And so the Bolsheviks suddenly has to take a decision. And the decision was take the lead. Not to seize power, not to overthrow the provisional government, but to prevent the demonstration from getting out of control. There are 500,000 people in the streets of Petrograd. They are all around the government building. Reformists inside are scary, are terrified. At one point, the social revolutionary minister, Chernov, goes out to talk to the people. And some soldiers grab him and shout on his face, "When they give you power, you take it, you bastard!" Chernov is saved not by the reformists. They cannot really do anything. It is Trotsky that saves him, using his authority to get him freed. And I think that, honestly speaking, that the workers were not very happy with Trotsky in that moment. In this situation, there are also provocation by the officer, the right wing, the military. Someone shoots at the masses from the roofs. The government, in panic, calls in loyal troops from outside Petrograd. They arrive in the night, and that changes the balance of. And as soon as armed with these troops, the Soviet leaders they don't panic and they unleash the repression. There eventually will be a few hundred. But it must be clear that without the intervention by the Bolsheviks, it would have been a complete bloodbath. Now, the consequence of the July day is a shift to the right in the situation, starting from the government. In particular, a hunt is unleashed against the Bolsheviks. The offices of Pravda, the newspaper, are devastated. Bolshevik militants are taken, are beaten, are arrested. An arrest order is issued for Lenin, Zinoviev, and Kamenev. Lenin, in the first moment, he wants to turn himself in to have a political trial, like Trotsky during the first revolution. But the Bolsheviks eventually convinced him to go into hiding. This is not cowardice. This is it was not needed show, a display of useless display of courage in this situation. He wouldn't have had a political trial. He would have up like with Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, murder while under arrest in January 1990. And this would have decapitated the party and the revolution. Instead, it was necessary to preserve the revolutionary leadership in order to resist the reactionary phase, the reactionary stage, and prepare for the next advance. Now, the repression against the Bolsheviks by the reformists gives courage to the right, especially to the generals who wanted to bring order in the situation. In the middle of July, it's 18th of July, General Kornilov is appointed Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. He demands a radical change and set the following conditions: re-establish death penalty in the army, prohibition of assemblies at the front line, dissolution of the revolutionary military units, and of the power of the soldiers' committees. You can hear the voice of the open reaction here. And also, he wants death penalty for civilians, martial law, prohibition of strikes in the railway and defense industry. In fact, what he wants are dictatorial powers. Kerensky doesn't want to give them because he wants to be the one to concentrate all the power in its own hands. And so the clash is inevitable. And at the end of August, Kornilov began to advance towards Petrograd, to take it by force. He has some significant forces from a military point of view, with troops from even from the most backward parts of the Tsarist Empire. Now you can imagine the situation in Petrograd. The provisional government is in absolute panic. And so in order to save itself, it has to ask the Bolsheviks for help, because they know that they are the only ones who can defeat Kornilov. And so now the Bolsheviks are released from the prison and they are invited to the committee for the fight against the counter-revolution, which, to be honest, largely depends on the military organization of the Bolsheviks. What is the position of the Bolsheviks? The position is this: we will fight against Kornilov counter-revolution. But that doesn't mean that we will be supporting Kerensky's government. To use Lenin's words, put the rifle on Kerensky's shoulders to fight Kornilov. And then, when Kornilov we will come to terms with Kerensky. You see, this is not an endorsement of the government. It's rather a way of exposing its weakness. Fighting the counter-revolution, but also showing to the masses that the reformists are incapable of doing that. Kornilov's troops are strong, but they break up. Not by direct military confrontation, but by revolutionary means. Railwaymen sabotage trains and send them on deadlines in the middle of nowhere. And at that point, the Bolshevik agitators confront the rebel troops, who largely simply deserts. They go home. The officers are arrested by their own men. And so the reactionary revolt collapses. And now having defeated Kornilov's revolt, the conditions are created for a rapid and powerful advance of the Bolsheviks. On the basis of, not just of explanation, but of the concrete, of the real experience, of the material experience, the masses measured the different parties, and so that the Bolsheviks were the only ones who fought to defend the revolution and to carry on and to carry forward the demands of the masses. They saw that all these accusations, all these lies leveled at them were absolutely false. This change in the consciousness is reflected in an advance by the Bolshevik in the Soviet election. They take majority, one Soviet after the other. On the 9th of September, there is there is a frontal clash, head-on clash in the Petrograd Soviet, and the Bolsheviks win the battle. This also happened in early October in the Moscow Workers' Soviet and many other areas of the. And not only this, but new forces enters the Bolshevik party directly. In February, the party had only 8,000 militants. In the midst of the revolution, they rose to 8,000 in April. 80,000. 80,000 in April, 240,000 in August. Of course, it's not possible to get such figures. They were not just filling up registration forms. This gives an idea of the growth possibility of a party in a revolutionary. And now, yes, in this new situation, Lenin poses the question of insurrection. Now, at last, the balance of forces is there to take power. But they won't last forever. One must act at the right moment. But, I must say, as always, he finds some opposition inside the party from Zinoviev and Kamenev, and from Stalin as well. Although as always, he manifests it less clearly, trying not to too much. Just think it was his style. Lenin is still hidden, and these leaders in Petrograd, they make a series of mistakes following the reformist proposal to prop up the provisional government, such as the pre-parliament, wasting time, wasting the condition that were created in the weeks before. You can imagine Lenin is like a tiger in a cage in that moment. He writes from Finland to demand a quick decision for insurrection. At one point, I think that the 10th of October, there is a CC meeting. He gets to attend this CC meeting wearing a wig. And finally, the 16th of October, a new meeting of a large extended CC passes a resolution on the need for an immediate revolution. Even then, Lenin had to contend with the vacillation of the Bolshevik leaderships. Kamenev and Zinoviev vote against the resolution, accepted from a democratic point of view, maybe not from a political point. But a few days later, they publish an article on an independent newspaper in which they openly declare that they are against the insurrection. In fact, revealing to the whole world the plan for the insurrection. Of course, Lenin immediately demands their expulsion from the party. But this is the mean, to say the less. But in the end, that's teaching. In the end, they will not be expelled. And after the revolution, they will even receive immediately party and Soviet state responsibilities. That also says something about Lenin's method. And, this internal dictator in the party, not allowing debates, taking organizational measures. That was not Lenin's party. That was Stalin's party later. Now, going back to the insurrection, the government itself provides the opportunity for insurrection. Because, even when all the conditions exist for an insurrection, from a tactical point of view, it is always better to present it as a defense measure, to convince a broader layer. And, as I said, the government provides occasion. Of course, know that is an insurrection, and they know that the troops who are stationing in Petrograd support them. So they demand to move 2/3 of the Petrograd garrison to the front line. You can imagine the consequence. They want to weaken these troops, but they provoke them. The Bolsheviks denounce it as a counter-revolutionary act and set up a revolutionary military committee headed by Trotsky. Not just Bolshevik, but as an organ, a military organism of the Soviet. And it is this committee that manage the insurrection. It appoints political commissars in every armed depot, arms the Red Guards. And now, yes, it prepare the insurrection also from a military point. But, this is an important point. Many bourgeois historians describe the October Revolution as just a military operation, if not a proper coup d'état, as if it was only possible for a handful of revolutionary conspirators to seize power through a diabolic plan against the state apparatus and against the will of the masses. No, the truth is that the October Revolution took place in broad daylight. You saw it. They even published the plan of the insurrection days before. It only was the logical consequence of the new political relation. Of course, this political consequence could realize only because the existence of a revolutionary leadership. It was the Bolshevik Party under Lenin and Trotsky. But could I say, they only could enact what was already there in potential. And in fact, the insurrection had virtually no resistance whatsoever, not for military reasons, but simply because no one was willing to defend the government. And in fact, the October Revolution was essentially a peaceful revolution. You know, for the ones who love cinema, you know, when the great director Eisenstein shot the film October, there is this scene, yeah, of the taking of the Winter Palace. Some accidents, some actors and workers who was working on this film died shooting this scene. In reality, more people died shooting the film on the taking of the Winter Palace, actually taking it. The garrison, the soldiers are not taken with the sophisticated military plan. The garrison is not taken with the military, but with political agitation, mainly run by Trotsky and other Bolshevik agitators, which politically convinced them, the soldiers, to take side. Even there were even doubtful units, vacillating units. For example, the motorcyclists, they didn't know that they were really doubtful. The Bolshevik didn't know what they would. And so what happened? Trotsky went there, called for a meeting inside the barracks. At the end of the discussion, they proposed to join the insurrection, passed unanimously. And Trotsky comments on his history of the Russian Revolution. Another possible armed conflict was resolved before the battle and without bloodshed. Such is the October Revolution. Such is its style. Far from being a conspiracy, the October Revolution is a succession of political rallies, fiery assemblies, and at all hours, where the Bolshevik agitators are launched to conquer the ground politically before they conquered it militarily. And Lenin said, in order to succeed, the insurrection must be based not on a plot, not on a party, but on the vanguard class. The insurrection must be based on the revolutionary impetus of the people. The October Revolution is the fulfillment of this revolutionary impetus. And so in the end, when in front of the Winter Palace, the cruiser Aurora fires its warning shots, the troops defending the government simply dissolve into the night. When revolutionary soldiers go inside the room, find the provisional government, and simply declare it under arrest. At the same time, the Congress of the All-Russian Soviet Congress opened its works. The Bolsheviks have now a majority not just in Petrograd, but in among the delegates from all the Russia. A majority inside the Soviets that was sanctioned outside the Congress by the victorious uprising of the Petrograd workers and soldiers. Trotsky declares in the Congress that the provisional government no longer exists and says, the characteristic of bourgeois government is to deceive the people. We, the Soviets of workers, soldiers and peasants' deputies, are going to try an experiment unique in history. We are going to find a power which will have no other aim but to satisfy the needs of the soldiers, the workers and the peasants. This, comrades, this was the Russian Revolution. This was the greatest event in human history. I finish my time, so I cannot go into details on how it developed later on. Maybe some comrades will say something, but I just want to say that the legacy, the genuine legacy of that revolution was hidden, was distorted, was degenerated, but it is still there, and it is now more needed than ever. And comrades, that legacy is for us to take.
Thanks to Alessio for an excellent and very inspiring lead-off. In a few minutes we will have a break, and afterwards we will. But first, a few announcements. In the later session, if you will be in the main theater, you will have to enter through the back door, not through the sides. That will make the steward's job of checking credential much easier. Alessio had a very small time frame. and he said a lot of things, but I think there's a lot more to say about the Russian Revolution and what we can learn from it today. So if you already know now that you want to participate in the discussion, come over to me, then I will put you on the speaker list here before the break. But we will break now for half an hour and be back 11:20. So I'll see you there. All right, comrades, we'll begin again. All right. Welcome back to the session about the Russian Revolution. First speaker in the discussion will be Ben from our British section, which will be followed by Franco from our Italian section.
So we talk about the Russian Revolution. The Marxists referred to the Russian Empire as the prison house of nations. And 57% of the population, they were not Russians, they were Poles, Latvians, Jews, Lithuanians, Finns. Yeah, Georgians, Armenians, Bashkirs, Kazakhs. And without the support of millions of these oppressed people, there would have been no Russian Revolution. And yet the history of Tsarist oppression had obviously created the strongest, bitterest national animosities amongst these oppressed people. And this created the most difficult challenge for the Russian Marxists, which was to unite the working class despite the divisions which had been inculcated by Tsarism. They had to assure the oppressed people that the Russian Bolsheviks were completely different to the Tsarist regime. They would not suffer the same oppression. They had to guarantee that they would give the greatest possible freedom to these oppressed people. And that meant nothing if they were not prepared to also accept their potential secession, that they would split away if they wanted to. So Lenin regarded it as absolutely vital that the Russian Marxists had to have inscribed on their program the right of nations to self-determination. And some Marxists didn't necessarily understand this. Rosa Luxemburg was a case in point. Now, she was a Polish Marxist, and the Polish bourgeoisie used this national animosity to try and divide the revolutionary movement. They tried to divide the Polish workers from the revolutionary Russian workers using nationalism in a poisonous manner. And of course, it seems strange that we support national self-determination, right? Because we as communists, we're in favor of a world socialist federation. We want to get rid of nation states. But isn't implicit in the idea of self-determination the possibility of creating new nation states? Yes, it very much is. But Lenin explained in counter to Rosa Luxemburg that yes, whilst it was her duty to fight Polish nationalism, the Russian Marxists had a different duty altogether. It was precisely to cement the unity of the working class and to actually make secession less likely, that the Russian Marxists had to say to the Polish workers and other workers, only you have the right to decide whether you have independence or not. We will not interfere in that question. Sorry. And how the Russian Revolution played out was precisely a demonstration of the correctness of Lenin's policy on this question. Because this national resentment, this anger, this hatred amongst the oppressed people could have led to two different results in 1917. That national animosity could be joined with all of the other senses of injustice in one revolutionary wave to sweep away Tsarism, or it could have led to the breakup of the Russian Empire into lots of competing nation states that would have descended into civil war and the Balkanization of the Russian Empire. And it was precisely the sensitive policy of the Bolsheviks on this question that allowed the former to take place and for these millions of workers to be brought behind the banner of communism. It's vital for communists to distinguish between what is reactionary and what is actually revolutionary and progressive amongst the national sentiment of oppressed peoples. We see how the Polish bourgeois used nationalism in a reactionary way. But with respect to the nationalism of the Latvian peasantry, Trotsky described it as merely the outer shell of an immature Bolshevism. In the Baltic regions in particular, many of the lords that oppressed the peasantry were actually from German backgrounds. And so many of the Latvian peasants actually volunteered to sign up in the First World War to kill the Germans out of hatred of their own German lords. But when the revolution broke out in 1917, that confused class anger was turned into massive support amongst the Latvian regiments for the Bolsheviks. Now, for the bourgeoisie in normal times, they demand that the oppressed peoples subordinate their class interests to the general national interests of the capitalist class. Now, the bourgeois and petty bourgeois nationalist leaders in the oppressed nationalities would use nationalism to try to gain concessions from Tsarism, but they were terrified were not prepared to call for a revolutionary national struggle against Tsarism. That's where they drew the line. And when the revolution broke out, their fear of the proletariat led them to line up 100% behind the national Russian bourgeoisie. Now, in Georgia, which was relatively backward, the Bolsheviks were relatively weak compared to the Mensheviks in 1917. Many of the most prominent Menshevik leaders, like Tsereteli and Chaidze, actually came from Georgia. And they used their influence actually to hold back the national aspirations of the Georgians. Just like the Russian bourgeoisie said, wait for the Constituent Assembly to decide the questions of peace, land and bread. They said, wait for the Constituent Assembly, which never came to decide the question of our independence. So actually the national question served to undermine these compromises like in Georgia and other oppressed parts of the Russian Empire and bring them to the side of Bolshevism. Actually, we see in Russia itself as well how the bourgeoisie placed its class interests above the national interest. They had denounced Lenin as a German agent right up until October 1917. But by September 1917, when the Bolsheviks were gaining mass support, they prepared to surrender Petrograd to the Germans. Just like the French ruling class prepared to surrender Paris in 1871 to the Prussians to teach the workers a lesson. They surrendered Riga on the Baltic Sea to the Germans for a start. The provisional government tried to move ammunition out of Petrograd, and they started making preparations to move the capital in September from Petrograd to Moscow for that reason. And along with the march of Kornilov on Petrograd, this helped to push millions of workers and peasants to the side of the Bolsheviks. Now, there's no time to speak about the policy of the Bolsheviks after the seizure of power in October 1917. But we see a similarly sensitive policy on the part of the Bolsheviks to the oppressed peoples in Ukraine, for example, which was a key theater in the Civil War. Now, finally, we have many examples in contrast to the Russian Revolution which provide a negative example. In the latest issue of In Defense of Marxism, there is an article about the Ethiopian Revolution, where the young radicals also referred to the country as a prison house of nations in 1974. And without a Bolshevik party, precisely because of the national question, the country descended into civil war and famine. So today it's clear from Balochistan to Catalonia to Palestine to Ukraine, the national question can play a key, even a decisive role in the revolutionary epoch in which we have entered. And it was only the correct policy of Bolshevism which allowed the Russian Revolution to be successful in 1917, and from which we have to learn today.
Thanks to Ben. He was a very good example because he spoke loud and in short sentences, so the translators have time to translate everything he says. And I will encourage everybody else to do the same. Now it's Franco, and followed by Alex from Brazil.
Some bourgeois and reformist historians glorify the February Revolution as a peaceful movement that gave birth to a democratic parliamentary republic on the model of the Western countries. A democratic parliamentary republic on the model of the Western countries. On their opinion, on the opinion of these historians, this exemplary democratic process was completely destroyed by the violent imposition of the Bolshevik dictatorship in October. Also, in the left, the prevailing idea is that the conditions for a socialist revolution were not ripe in Russia in 1917, and that the October insurrection was a tragic mistake. It would have been far better to wait, consolidate parliamentary democracy, and talk about socialism in a second stage. When Kamenev and Zinoviev opposed the insurrection in the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party, they proposed such a line: organize a strong opposition bloc in the forthcoming Constituent Assembly, use bourgeois democratic rights to strengthen the party, and so on. This apparently very wise analysis is completely false. Instead, historical events show very clearly that there was no place for parliamentary democracy in Russia in 1917. Had the Bolsheviks not taken power as Kamenev and Zinoviev proposed, a ruthless counter-revolutionary dictatorship would have taken the place of parliamentary democracy. Dictatorship. The first move of the provisional government was try to restore the monarchy by putting the crown on the head of one of the Tsar brothers. From the point of view of the liberal bourgeoisie, rebuilding the old repressive apparatus of Tsarism was indeed the only way to protect property and restore order. After the failure of the attempt to restore Tsarism, the bourgeoisie immediately began to organize a coup. As early as April, Milyukov, the foreign minister and the leader of the Liberal Party, Milyukov, attempted a coup. This coup failed only because the soldier of the Petrograd garrison refused to obey orders that did not come from the Soviet. In August, General Kornilov was not the only one to attempt a coup. At the same time, the head of the Democratic Provisional Government, Kerensky, was organizing a military conspiracy against the Bolsheviks and the Soviets. The illusion of democracy was kept alive only by the reformist parties, but these parties were becoming weaker and weaker, lacking a base of support. During the July days, hundreds of thousands of workers and soldiers demanded that the Mensheviks and the revolutionary socialists take power. And the Mensheviks and the socialist revolutionary unleashed the Cossacks and the Junkers against the workers. These moderate socialists could only carry out their progressive policies by relying on the most reactionary sectors of the army, which had been the bulwark of the Tsarist repressive apparatus. The provisional government was paralyzed for most of its existence. All reforms were postponed until the next Constituent Assembly, but elections to the Constituent Assembly were postponed again and again. It was not until the Bolsheviks took power that elections to the Constituent Assembly were held. The very ephemeral history of the Constituent Assembly demonstrates the weakness of the bourgeois democratic illusions in the Russian Revolution. When the Constituent Assembly attempted to stand as an alternative power to the Soviets, the Bolsheviks ordered its dissolution. The deputies were dispersed peacefully, without a shot being fired, because no one lifted a finger to defend the deputies. During the Civil War, revolutionary socialists created in the city of Samara a democratic anti-Bolshevik government in the name of the Constituent Assembly. Power was initially in the hands of a committee of the Constituent Assembly. All the members were revolutionary socialists. They then allied with other anti-Bolshevik forces to restore democracy. They created a 5-member directorate, 2 revolutionary socialists, 2 liberals, and a general. Historians call this the democratic counter-revolution. This directorate controlled an important part of the former Tsarist empire. Siberia, the Urals, the Volga region, probably more territory than the Bolsheviks controlled at the time. They enjoyed the support of the majority of elected deputies in the Constituent Assembly. They also had access to the state's gold reserves and could count on the abundant supplies provided by the Western democratic powers, as France and Great Britain. But this government of people deputies had no support among the masses. It depended for its survival on foreign troops, in particular 30,000 Czech soldiers. This wonderful democratic government was short-lived. It lasted only from September to November 1918. It was overthrown not by the terrible Bolsheviks, but by a coup organized by the Tsarist generals and replaced by the military dictatorship of Admiral Kolchak. This coup had the full support of the bourgeoisie and the British and French representatives in Russia. The former ruling classes, generals and bourgeois politicians, didn't want parliamentary democracy. We wanted to return to the situation before the February Revolution. For the white generals, all socialists had to be hanged. It didn't matter whether they were Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, or revolutionary socialists. In October 1918, the directorate moved to Omsk in Siberia. The garrison of the city consisted of Siberian Cossacks. The city was full of officers who got drunk in the nights and sang "God Save the Tsar." This was the army of the democratic counter-revolution. Kolchak ordered the arrest of all members of the Constituent Assembly, calling them enemies of the state. If the Bolshevik had not taken power, there would have been no years of peaceful parliamentary development, but a bloody counter-revolution that would have brought to power a military dictatorship what would have slaughtered not only the Bolsheviks, but also the reformists, the moderate, the Democrats, as the fascists did in other countries. This is the truth about the undeniable historical necessity of the October Revolution, which was not usurpation, but the only way of salvation for the masses of Russian workers. Thank you.
Thanks to Franco. Now it will be Alex from Brazil, and followed by Jamie from Britain.
First of all, congratulations for the very complete introduction. I'm just going to contribute by completing some of these ideas that I think are important to understand the Russian Revolution. Without a doubt, it's very important for us to study these revolutions and take lessons from them. I think we're all going to live through revolutions in our time and in our lifetimes and in our countries. And I hope that we are in the conditions to lead a revolution. So we must learn from the successful revolutions and the defeated revolutions to help the working classes of our countries to reach power. The same way that the Bolsheviks took lessons from the Paris Commune, which was fundamental for the Russian Revolution to reach power in 1917. The first thing is that I think that the Russian Revolution is a confirmation of the theory of the permanent revolution, the conclusions that Trotsky reached after the Revolution of 1905, that even in Russia, which was a backward country, that the objective was a socialist revolution. And it was not necessary to wait for socialist revolutions in the developed countries to advance a socialist revolution in Russia. And with this, Lenin reaches the same conclusions as Trotsky and writes the April Theses and leads the battle within the Bolshevik party to win people over to their positions. The other point is that a comrade has said in one of our meetings, the issue that the analysis of the program and strategy is a science, but strategy and tactics are an art. It depends on the concrete terrain, and flexibility is necessary. How to dialogue with the consciousness, the political consciousness of the masses. Lenin and the Bolsheviks came to the conclusion of the necessity of a revolution in Russia. But this doesn't mean that the masses had reached that conclusion already. So I think that the idea of the united front and transitional demands are a key part of the revolution, because we are not sectarian. We're not the type of people that insult and say that the leaders of the working classes are traitors. If there is a majority of the working classes that trust these leaders, we must say what they must do, and they should do it. And that's why the demands that were made by the Bolsheviks are very important. Bread, peace, and land. Down with the 10 capitalist ministers, which was not just down with the government, but that this government is allied with the bourgeoisie. And all power to the Soviets. In a context which, as Alessio explained, the Bolsheviks were in a minority. In the first pan-Russian Soviet Congress in June, the Bolsheviks were less than 15% of the delegates. So the issue of how communists must win the masses is a key lesson of the Russian Revolution. To win over the majority and meet the goal of taking power. And the third lesson that I think is important, which is the issue of the party. Trotsky said that even in Spain in the 30s, that the masses had a level of conscience which was even higher than that of the Russians in 1917. But they did not have a party like the Bolshevik party in Russia. That's why our fundamental task of building the revolutionary party, based on Marxist theory and the methods of Bolshevism, and of building the Revolutionary Communist International. In fact, one of the points of the April Theses is the need for a new international, which Lenin and Trotsky founded in 1919, being that's why our task in all of our different countries is to build parties that can lead and influence the masses, and of building the international Revolutionary Communist International. And we're already taking steps in this direction, and that the foundation of the RCI yesterday was a fundamental step in this direction as well. Thank you.
Thanks to Alex. Now will be Jamie from Britain, followed by Karen from Mexico.
Comrades, I will speak today about the way in which the Russian working class took power and the lessons that we can learn from this. Insurrection cannot be isolated from broader context. Rather, all of the laws of revolution are embodied there in their sharpest particular. Free conditions for revolution were outlined by Lenin appear in Insurrection as decisive tactical. These laws are, firstly, that the revolution, secondly, the upper classes, thirdly, that the middle classes. It was by making use of and encouraging along these that the Bolshevik Party was the support of the middle classes, especially as it was only through them that the proletariat could. Most reactionary layers of the up to there were paralyzed within. Although the peasantry at large hadn't voted, mass desertions army and the support of the peasantry was only won afterwards with the land reform. This is because the outcome of revolution is not determined by formal but by the strengths of classes. Under the correct conditions, most advanced layers of the on the paralyzed, even among the working class. Some of the delegates, they were won over precisely because of you cannot wait for a chemical pure insur. It's very unlikely. This arises the important which is the welding together. We today are to be the vanguard of the class as the Bolshevik proactive. If we are to be during a revolution, party only lasts for advanced. It won't be as simple if in October the revolution had been discoordinated. The example proves that and this could have. So most of the peasant garrisons trending towards albeit with relative Trotsky and the drew up a concrete plan relied on the which relied on the varying strengths and weaknesses of the workers, the soldiers, and the sailors. I don't have time to go into details about this, but comrades should read Trotsky's history. Since the ruling class was so isolated and the working class so unified, the insurrection unfolded practically like a police. Individual administrative centers and government buildings, the railway stations, the post offices, and so on, were seized by small groups, but there was no need for the masses to prove their support in bloody clashes, because they had already shown their support through the elections to the Soviets. Now, our understanding of insurrection flows from that of the general political context, and is thus in accordance with our theoretical understanding of the proletarian revolution. Nevertheless, it must be adapted to the particular situation, and as an art with an independent significance, it has its own particular laws besides those of the revolution as a whole. These laws were first explained by Engels in a work which he published under Marx's name about the German revolutions of 1848. German Revolution. Lenin in September and October went back to these to learn the lessons of history. In particular, two key lessons. Firstly, that you cannot play with insurrection. It's impossible to prove mathematically that the moment is right for an insurrection to take place. But if you think that it is, then you must be committed to the end. Events prove that the Bolsheviks were correct in their assessment. In cities across the country, insurrections along the lines of Petrograd took place. And in those places where the petty bourgeoisie had strongholds, it was very easy to mobilize the local population and to bring in revolutionary detachments from the capital cities in order to liberate the working class. There isn't a single line of communist theory which denies that the revolution can, under certain conditions, be spread through military force. The question is whether the people that are being liberated actually support the liberation in the first place. You still can't hear? Okay, apologies. Yes, so then the second law which Engels explained is that insurrection must proceed along a continual offensive. If it halts to regroup its forces or to assume a defensive posture, then it will inevitably be crushed by the superior organization of the state. Here, however, I must issue a note of caution. Just because insurrection must proceed along a continual offensive does not mean that this law generalizes. It doesn't hold true in war in general, and especially not in the class struggle. There have been many historical examples of ultra-left catastrophes because people didn't understand this. I will skip over the remainder of what I had to say and just say that studying the relationship between the party and the masses during an insurrection provides probably the sharpest example of this relationship. And thus that studying it, both the comrades here and taking it back to our sections and our branches, will deepen the understanding of all comrades about the role of the party within the masses, in particular the relationship between mass action and conspiracy. And in this regard, I would recommend, again, reading Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. And I think that this applies in particular to the Palestinian interventions we've been doing recently. Thank you.
Thanks to Jamie. Now it will be Karen. But before that, a recommendation, which Jamie mentioned several times, and Alessio also mentioned in his lead-off, Trotsky's masterpiece, History of the Russian Revolution, which can be bought in the stalls down here, or which can be bought online from our publishing house, Relred.
Well, without a doubt, the Russian Revolution was by far the most inspiring and successful achievement of our in history in our lifetime. Because for the first time, the oppressed masses took power to lay down the foundations for the building of a new society. And one important question that arose was that of the question of education after the Russian Revolution. The conditions of lack of education and overall backwardness were very large and of big concern. 80% of the population was illiterate, and the women in Russia were even worse off, as 88% of them were illiterate, as opposed to 60% of the men in Russia. It was very clear that before the Russian Revolution, education was a privilege only available to the ruling class. A privilege that the peasantry and the workers of Russia had absolutely no access to. Their lives were purely consumed by exploitation and misery, without the possibility without the access to culture and learning and education overall. However, the Russian Revolution would dramatically transform these conditions. And it was the same illiterate workers who laid the foundations for the building of a new socialist society, for the for the transformation of education in Russia. Of course, under the direction of the Bolshevik Party, were Krupskaya and Lunacharsky, who was the commissary for the education of who was the people's commissary for education, who played a most important role. Lenin said, "It is precisely to educate It is precisely to educate in conjunction with the working class, so that it can be in conditions, to take up its role in combating for the emancipation of humanity, for the emancipation of the whole of for the whole of the oppressed or the oppressed classes." That was how one of the first decrees of the Bolshevik Party in 1918 was to guarantee education for all, from kids of 8 to 18 years of age. They were prohibited from going to work in the mines and in factories. Now education had to have a created focus, led by the working class, and to organize this initiative, led by the masses. They formed the Soviets for the purpose of education, that were elected by the people, and they themselves took charge of leading educational reforms in their zones. Marx and Engels spoke of in the Communist Manifesto of the necessity between education, of the association of education and manual labor, multidisciplinary political education, or just multidisciplinary education, and highlighted the inseparability between between education and politics. This is where Krupskaya plays a very important role in the development of multidisciplinary education, because she considered that it was.
Krupskaya considered that the merging of productive labor and teaching would help the new generations to notice the existence of all the different branches of the economy, because without this they would not be able to develop themselves as builders of socialism. The conditions were not simple and the resources available were few. So after a decade, the enrollment of the majority of the population in education had not been completed, nor was the application of multidisciplinary education realized. Despite all of this, in 1926, illiteracy had fallen to 57%, and with the death of Lenin and the rise of Stalinism, educational policy was changed. In 1929, Krupskaya and Lunacharsky abdicate or leave their positions, but despite this, the influence of the revolution continued. In 1939, only 19% of women and 6% of men didn't know how to read or write. And during the Cold War, 92% of women had professional education. There's an example in Mexico of socialist education, which came about in the 30s during the government of Lázaro Cárdenas, which was a project that answered to the need of forming workers that had the capacity to technify the country. That is, it was a program to educate the children of workers and peasants so that the recently expropriated industry would have labor force to build it. That's how the National Polytechnical Institute was founded, with secular, scientific, secular, and free education. However, Trotsky pointed out in regard to this that 5 years after socialist education in Mexico, the impossibility of such an education was shown to be impossible, because the social, economic, and political basis of this system in society remained in the hands of the bourgeoisie. And this situation made the realization of socialist education impossible. There can be no socialist education with hungry workers and poor peasants. And this was just an illusion of the radical petty bourgeoisie to compensate for their inability to take the revolutionary paths. And they posited this program as a new route toward the building of socialism. And this is the fundamental difference between this and the Russian Revolution, because Mexican socialist education only served for the consolidation of the bourgeois state and for the development of capitalism in Mexico. The general conditions of the working class in Mexico never changed. And to date, access to tertiary education is a privilege only for those who can access after a selection exam, which confirms Trotsky's words and makes us return to the example of Russia, where the only way for education to be an emancipatory tool and a road to socialism, this can only happen by freeing it from the control of the bourgeois state and of the interests of capitalism, and putting education under the democratic control of the new worker state toward the development of collective needs. This is how the glorious Russian Revolution demonstrated that in 30 years it was able to transform illiterate Russia in one of the greatest educational powerhouses of the world.
All right. Thank you, Karen. And thanks for all the thoughtful interventions from the comrades. Unfortunately, we couldn't bring all in the discussion, but I'm sure it will continue the rest of the week at this conference. Before Alessio sums up, I'll just make one more recommendation, which is of not this book, I already recommended that, of this book, which is a totally new book, In Defense of Lenin, which is a biography of the most important leader of the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin, which was published by our publishing house earlier this year. And like the other book, it can be bought down in the stalls or from Wellred's website. But now I will give the word to Alessio so he can sum up the discussion.
I must say, very good discussion. First of all, I must say that I never appreciated the importance of flexibility like in these last few days. Now, have been different good intervention. I cannot touch all of them. Alex was speaking about tactic and flexibility. I think that a lesson in this debate during the Russian Revolution on the Leninist approach towards the tactics was most of all the capacity to, in his words, have a concrete evaluation of the concrete situation. Any tactics comes from, of course, a deep theoretical understanding, but also from a concrete evaluation of the real situation. And to be honest, a deep theoretical understanding is only possible if you have a deep understanding of the concrete situation and how it develops. Otherwise, you have the risk to stay stuck in some abstract formulas. That is not real deep theoretical understanding. It's just a formula that can be right at a moment. Then when things change, you have to understand how to intervene in that situation. We saw this during the Russian Revolution, but we saw this along all the history of the Bolshevik Party. It is very educational to study the debates inside the Bolshevik Party on this point. And also, I think that since we are launching the Revolutionary Communist International, also to study the history of the Fourth International, and then the debates and the approach to theory by Ted Grant, that is a clear application of this Leninist method. Now he mentioned also the theory of the permanent revolution, and this is, as I want to say, this theory is completely connected to the idea not only of the task of the proletariat, but to the international extension of the revolution. In fact, immediately during the revolution, to be honest, already when Lenin wrote the April thesis, there was one which declared the necessity for a new international. And the Bolsheviks, from the first moment, saw the Russian Revolution not as just the task, the final task, but the need to break the chain of capitalism in its weak link to make possible the international revolution. And in fact, when the German Revolution started, Lenin immediately said that we must mobilize all we can to support this revolution, even let's say sacrifice, we could say, but exhaust our energy to make win the revolution in Germany. And that's how we always think on an international point of view. Also on the national question, as Ben explained very well. That is very important when what Ben explained. The Tsarist Empire was a prison of peoples. Wouldn't have been possible to make the revolution without addressing that problem. Even recently, Putin reminded that, saying that Ukraine doesn't exist, didn't exist historically. It was Lenin who made it. That is not true, of course, from an historical point of view about Ukraine, but it is true that it was Lenin who gave the possibility to autodetermination. And to give this right from a proletarian point of view, of course, it is the only way to make a true unity of the working classes. After the revolution, he explained even that since these oppressed people came from centuries of national oppression, from Grand Russian nationalism, it was not even equal enough to guarantee equal rights. But the Soviet government should have given more rights to the former oppressed people. And that was another thing that completely changed with the Stalinist degeneration of the revolution. It was one of the last battles of Lenin was precisely against what later had begun the form of the USSR as a unity of republics. It is the battle of Lenin against the Stalin proposal to have just a Russian federation, and Lenin pushed forward the need of unity of Soviet republics. And all the Stalinist regime, even after Stalin, was characterized by a reborn of Grand Russian nationalism. And it was used by the imperialists to, of course, to instrumentalize the search for self-determination of these people. But most importantly, in some cases, for example, the Hungarian Revolution, the battle against the national oppression was fused with the battle for a political revolution. No, but I have not the time to get into too much into details of that. Well, Franco well explained what was the real alternative for the bourgeoisie. To be honest, it was the alternative we saw already where the revolution was not fulfilled in the history of revolutions. We saw it during the Civil War. We saw it with the invasion of 21 armies. The Russian ruling class, under the leadership of the imperialism, was not disposed to give any concession. It was only a try to weaken the revolution, to create the condition to crush it. But even those armies were defeated not just by a military point of view, but by making the soldier defeat with the revolutionary propaganda, although also by military means. And the building up of the Red Army was quite an important thing made by Trotsky. But that says a lot about the relation between military confrontation and it always has a political base, a class base in revolutionary politics and in a revolution. And also, of course, it is important to study insurrection as also a technical aspect. Well, it was quoted Engels. Engels was famous to have a passion for military aspects things. But I think that the common characteristic of revolution is that the military, so the state apparatus, the repression apparatus, collapses on itself, and that's because it has a class line inside itself, and it must be broken on this class line. And so that's why the political agitation is so much important. Of course, when you ask a soldier to desert, you cannot do just making just abstract speeches. It's a difficult decision to take because if the revolution fails, they would be shot. And so the political agitation must fuse with the demonstration of the will to fulfill until the end the task of the revolution. That's why, all this so wise, so good feelings, pacifist position during a class struggle ultimately strengthen the position, the possibility to violently defeat the struggle, because we weaken the feeling of the decision of the working class and the revolution to go until the end. But again, the political aspect and the political class propaganda is the main point. Now, Karen spoke about the development in culture after the revolution. This is very, very important because the achievements that was made in Russia after the revolution were really unprecedented in history from all the point of view. The development of the productive forces of the working class, but all of this was not just a question of working conditions or economic data. That should be the material basis for a complete elevation of human life, call it with the name. And it is impressive what they could achieve in those conditions, as we said, in backwardness and a civil war, as well a flourishing of culture, of the one to develop, the human being in all of his potentials. Of course, given those very difficult conditions, it was we saw just a glimpse of what it could be possible under a planned economy and a socialist society. And that is well known also by the bourgeoisie. That's what it after decades still stay there as an example of the potential, just the potential of a different kind of society. I have to sum up. Well, Jamie spoke about the conditions for the revolution. In fact, we are seeing some of these conditions accumulating on a world level. Especially now, it's clear that the first condition is that the ruling class cannot rule as it was used to do previously. The contradiction, are going more and more accumulating. So that's why we will see revolutions, not in the past, but in the future. And we must study the higher examples. We have a longer repertoire of failed revolutions, and we must study them also to learn from the defeats and the errors. But the Russian Revolution gave us the possibility to study the lesson from a success. But that is possible only if we study it in depth, as I said. So if this discussion is just a brief introduction, I must say. Because when you read the text, Trotsky, by all the writings by Lenin, we are publishing with the well-read, the 1917 writing by Lenin. It is really a gold mine. And you can see and recognize all different situations where we will be intervening. And so that's why what we are having here, just our preparation for our future tasks, to build revolutionary organization, revolutionary parties, a revolutionary communist international, which sometimes will have to be also the most proactive part. Not only that, communists, as Marx said in the manifesto, the end, last analysis, the communists are the ones who have the general view and who must be able to see the general process, to understand step by step the different tasks that can vary a lot in different situations, but knowing how to do that, finally they are means and are the way to get to the final task. That still is the overthrowing of this brutal system and the beginning of a whole new society.
There will be a session here called What is Capitalism? There will be a session in the hotel area over there called Did Communism Really Fail? And then there will be a session in the main theater, which are in an internal session about the question of Palestine. But we will break off for lunch now, and I'll see you again at 3 o'clock.